Decades, centuries, millennia of peace prepared no one for war, and though it was in some ways small scale, involving a limited number of personnel, it was the largest that the galaxy had seen in thousands of years. And one side, at least, was cut completely unaware. And thus, we had the Clone Wars. Before the war, before the clones, the galaxy was singularly ill-equipped for conflict, and you would have to very hastily change that. Starships abound in the lanes of the galaxy, hyperspace and regular space, planetary orbital, orc clouds of systems, going and coming commerce, some patrol, some policing, some pirates, some bounties, but large-scale military conflict. No, there were very few vessels, even on the drawing boards for that 30, 40 years before the Death Star. Some vessels would end up well enough suited for retrofit into cruisers, frigates, carriers, support vehicles. But others were too expensive or just singularly unequipped for it. For example, the starships of Naboo, highly polished, high degree of manufacturing, and, like the N-1 fighter, effective as a planetary or system defense craft. Much too expensive, much too much of a hot rod, much too short range for galactic war. And the other vessels were yachts and cruisers for dignitaries and royalty, at most high-speed skiff transports. So what we found were a few system defense craft, but each system had its own designs and own ways of doing things. There was not a standard. There was not compatibility. And again, they were made in small numbers, usually with very limited range and limited abilities. Plus, many would end up going to the seppies. One manufacturer that actually made ships that proved decent was Corellia. They had made some armed merchantmen, often reused by pirates, that could be used for at least troop transports and supply ferries. And they had some cruisers that, unarmed before the war, slap some weaponry on it, add some more armor. And then you did have some consular vessels that had limited self-defense capabilities that could be enhanced. So typically when you see reworked pre-war vessels, they're going to be Corellian in origin, and we will return to these. But as far as fighters and cruisers from places like Naboo and other rich core worlds, they had a rude awakening coming, because they were not in any way prepared or used to fighting or the war. But that's what the clones were for. And the clones, they came with hardware and lightware, laserware, something. So let's visit the year 22 BBY. The clone army had to be created from scratch. Not just the soldiers themselves, their armor, their weapons, other equipment, both their transports and craft. And of course, this would take a monumental effort, essentially unlimited funding, and still over a decade. And it was only thanks to forward-thinking and security-minded, patriotic politicians that it happened. But work began as far back as 35 BBY, with the first clones started to be grown at Camino in 32 BBY. And work on their first transport started at Rothana Heavy Engineering around the same time, and it would take quite a bit of time to build the fleet. So this was the initial clone assault ship, attack ship, cruiser, transport, base of operations, the Venator-class. And it actually harkens back to centuries or even millennium old designs of an arrowhead shape, which are uniquely well suited for both intergalactic travel and operating within an atmosphere, and even landing on the surface of a planet. And unfortunately, history books often overlook the Acclimator, but in some ways it remained the preeminent armed heavy transport throughout the entirety of the Clone War and beyond. This is not a small vessel, cruiser, over 750 meters long, 460 meters wide, and over 180 meters tall, so lots of room. Now, she only had a standard operating crew of 700, actually quite small for that size. But, thanks to all the internal volume and, use of structure, she could carry up to 16,000, not 100, but 1,000 troopers. And that was her primary role. She had a large bay for directly deploying them or deploying equipment vehicles. She had reinforced neutronium hull, for the time strong shield generator system, a very advanced nav system designed to go halfway across the galaxy, and a very fast primary hyperdrive of class 0.6. Even decades later, this would be considered fast, but for the era of the Republic, very much so. Even her backup was a class 10, which, while you're not going to get somewhere fast and far, it's better than a lot of other backups of the era. So good range, and she had enough supplies on board to operate for 6 months, and a lot of troops. She was also well defended. She had a dozen heavy quad turbolaser batteries for defense and bombardment. She had 24 lighter point defense laser cannon installations, and she had 4 launcher tubes. These were often filled with 20 concussion missiles each for assault, but they could carry up to 10 torpedoes each if that was needed. So from a galaxy that had no armed vessels, this was quite the striking jump forward. And because the clones are one of the few groups qualified to operate a military vessel at this time, 22 BBY, they primarily were the only crew, although sometimes Republic officers would appear, probably more getting in the way than anything else. Clones would stay out of the politics. They knew their purpose. They were literally born and bred for it. Even though they were 10 years old, in actuality they were 20 years old and ready for combat, although it would kick off a bit prematurely in 22 BBY with the first Battle of Geonosis. At that time, just before the outbreak of the Clone Wars, just before the Separatist aggression, about 200,000 clones were trained and ready to go and equipped. In other videos, we've talked about their armor and weapons, the ground forces and their vehicles, but this is about the Navy. This is about space. Of the 200,000, 192,000 would immediately be deployed to Geonosis, along with a dozen acclimators, and they would turn the tide. It was a very rapid assault. The arrogant separatists with their mechanical army knew that the Republic had no armed forces, so to have nearly 250,000 drop out of the sky, quite literally, took them unawares, and this was cutting-edge technology. While there were not all that many acclimators available at the very beginning of the war, their initial performance there inspired the Senate to actually do something. Luckily, the Chancellor was granted powers to speed things up, and 1,000 more acclimators were ordered. And these really would remain the fastest and most capable troop transports throughout the entirety of the war. Nothing else could carry quite as many people as safely and well defended. And they not only could land directly on a planet and directly deploy their troops onto, say, a hard surface. Soon after Geonosis, at the Battle of Mon Calamar, they would land on water. Yes, this quite large vessel could float, essentially. They could also land, or at least hover, over less stable surfaces in quite a wide range of terrains, so they served quite well as a landing force. However, sometimes an acclimator couldn't or shouldn't directly intervene, or needed to stay in orbit for defensive purposes. And that gets us to the other initial clone vehicle spaceship. From the acclimator would launch the low altitude assault transport, the LOT gunship, although clones would know it as the Lardy. And this would be the primary attack gunship, assault craft, and just general kind of armed transport for the clones throughout the entire Clone War, but especially in the beginning. And it was also designed by Rothana Heavy Engineering to really work in conjunction with the acclimator. There were two primary versions, the Lot I infantry and the Lot C cargo. The acclimator could carry up to 66 of the smaller, or at least lighter, I's, and another 14 of the larger, heavier cargo versions. And this was very adaptable, customizable, much in the vein of other aircraft. It was a repulsor lift. It could travel from orbit to surface on its own power, and it had enough energy and supplies to operate for 8 hours before refueling. However, it could not travel from surface to orbit again. On the other hand, it could also be used on space-to-space operations, ship-to-ship boarding or assault, or ship-to-station, maybe some other low-gravity bodies, an asteroid or a small moon. Very versatile craft. About 17 wingspan, 17 meters by a little under 18 meters overall length. So not tiny. In an atmosphere, it had a maximum speed of about 650 kmh. It did have a shield, but it did not, as a general rule, have a hyperdrive. Although certain space variants could have a hyperdrive, a slow one fitted in the cargo hold, as well as even having artificial gravity grids installed, but this was not standard. In fact, seats were not standard. The main purpose, we had a crew of 2, pilot, co-pilot / gunner observer, in a tandem cockpit. And the infantry variant could carry up to 30 troops, and the cargo variant could usually carry 1 larger piece of artillery or a walker or some other thing. Even the infantry could carry a few speeder bikes, though, stowed up. So good cargo carrying for its cost and abilities. And it was well defended. We had 2 anti-personnel laser turreted weapons in the front and a third one at the rear to cover it. In addition, we had 2 composite laser beam weapons, one in each wing, remotely operated by the gunner. These gave very good coverage. There was an optional, as you can see with these examples, additional 2 turrets that could be mounted to the front outboard. These would actually have additional gunners in them, raising the crew to 4. And again, we're composite laser, but we're not always fitted. And then under the wings, we had 8 anti-personnel, anti-droid rockets per wing. And then finally, above, we had 2 mass driver launchers, typically each fitted with a belt of 30 concussion-style missiles each, although these could be changed out depending on the role. And as you see, they have massive doors. Sometimes they would be swept back, sometimes forward, sometimes removed altogether. There's not much inside. The troops better stand well. They could either land and evacuate through the doors, or they could rappel while these were hovering and allowing the Lardy to provide cover fire. So for its size and cost, it was very well armed and armored, but it was not especially maneuverable, and again, it could not return to orbit, so it wasn't really good for rescue missions, and it really couldn't stand with any starfighters that might appear. Of course, early on, these were few and far between, and the whole idea was more for the clone army to be an army assault individual. But it would not take long at all before dogfighting would come into it. Fleet defense, escort missions, reconnaissance, scouting, and guess who got to fly those? Of course, the clones, because the Republic citizens, good as they might be, were soft and ill-equipped for war. Whereas weapons were designed for them, and we have 2 very good vessels. One thing the clones did not have at the beginning was a true starfighter. So something would have to jump in to fill the gap. Camino, Rothana, and other parties and companies working on the Grand Army of the Republic looked around to see what projects were in development around the galaxy and what maybe local systems had a fighter or an interceptor that could be adapted for clone use and mass production. Ironically, one of the groups that had the most modern and capable fighter were the Jedi. You cannot blame the clones for trusting them. The clones were young. They were told to trust them. They're their generals, their commanders. Although the fact that they were making 14-year-olds commanders should have been a tip-off that they had duplicitous intentions. Another was that they had a fighter program, said to have started after the blockade of Naboo, around 32 BBY. This was an evolution and development of the more civilian Delta 6. And by 27 BBY, the early prototypes of the Delta 7 Ether Sprite would be released and would be essentially created and flown exclusively by the Jedi. They kept a tight control. They even had the gall or wisdom, depending on your point of view, to paint these in diplomatic red, even though they were very much armed. This is a very thin, light, nimble craft. 8 meters long, but only 4 meters wide and under 2 meters tall at its highest point. It even had lightweight composite hull armor to keep things down. Now, it did have a shield generator, although it wasn't the most powerful. As you would imagine, this did not have the biggest power plant in the world. We have 2 main engines in the back, quite powerful for their size and considering the lightweight of this craft. In atmosphere, it could get up to nearly 1,300 kph, and in space, it had very good acceleration and maneuverability. It also had very good long-range communications, and it had very good sensors. Crew of 1, as you might imagine, with a clamshell-style canopy, and an astromech droid for communications, repair, and basically keeping the ship safe, because the Jedi wanted no one in their computer systems when the pilot was out. Now, this was an R3, later R4 series droid, but only half of one. He was hardwired in, so literally had no choice but to go down with the ship. Quite interesting. Very nimble little craft, and reasonably well armed for its size. It had 2 twin Tamco laser cannon, and some were even later fitted with bolt-on ordnance launchers or pods or other things. And there's a lot of real estate underneath at the very least. This was the brainchild in the Delta series by Walix Blissex, Blissex. I didn't name him. And we'll see his name more than once in this documentary. So, this might seem like something well suited to a clone. Now, obviously, it doesn't have a hyperdrive built in. However, it is actually capable at FTL speed. When docked to this, a Cyrix hyperdrive ring. And when docked, thanks to the rather large ring and the rather small craft, it was actually a Class 1.0 hyperdrive. So quite fast. Not as fast as an acclimator, but very few things were. Of course, there wasn't a backup, so let's hope the ring isn't lost, destroyed, damaged, or otherwise malfunctions. But it did give it range and a level of independence that you would not have even seen on much larger craft. The ring also gave it additional power and even water. Detached, it had about 5 hours of operational fuel and power, but attached up, that could be extended out for days. So it really would extend the life for more observation missions if it needed to park itself somewhere to observe. So why did this not work out for the clones? Today, knowing of the Jedi's treason, Imperial historians and clone veterans might just say they wanted to keep this for themselves, not share their technology, not give what they consider to be the enemy the edge. This is partially true. Of course, we also have to consider that, again, the Jedi did operate as generals, so they technically were not just part of, but actually commanding the Grand Army in the first place. Still yet, they didn't share. Another part was, though, this was designed outside of the comms and sensors to be very stripped down. It was very fast, very well handling, but it had very basic nav systems, very responsive, over-responsive, really controls. It was very difficult without the mystical force user to fly, that old religion. And so it may not have been well suited to young clones who had never hopped on board, not to mention standard Republic pilots, which were mostly wet behind the ears unless they were mercenaries or bounty hunters that were paid into serving. So the Delta 7 would remain throughout the Clone Wars, even up through major battles, say 19 BBY over Coruscant, but most all in the hands of Jedi with very, very few exceptions. So that wasn't going to work out for the clone troops. But there were other ideas and options. Meet the V-19 Torrent, the Clone Army's first, least successful fighter interceptor. And it was designed to operate from the acclimator and escort and support the Lardies, the lot gunships. This was developed at Slane and Corpil, and the design really was on the drawing board before 22 BBY, but with the need very clear, these were kind of rushed into full service. Prototypes had been created, pre-production models, but full production had yet to ramp up. It was kind of initially developed as a VTOL or VSTOL capable craft to operate from a planet or starbase to support a system. But they found it adaptable for clone use. It's quite short at only 6 meters, but with the wings fully extended, 26 meters wide, and in flight mode here, 9 meters tall. So not the smallest. But we have 3 quite powerful engines, and again it is capable of takeoff and landing vertically, which, to be fair, most starships are, but still. In atmosphere, it's a little slower than the Jedi Delta, at about 1150 to 1200 kph, but it has good acceleration and maneuverability in space. Primary armament are 2 medium laser cannon on the wingtips, with secondary armament 2 ordnance launchers, typically fitted with 3 concussion missiles each, so half a dozen missiles. Not bad for a superiority fighter. Not as good, no shielding, at least to standard, and no hyperdrive, although into the war, some hyperspace docking rings would be retrofitted to work with a variant of this, but because of the wing situation, not especially good. So yeah, these were rushed into service in 22 BBY, and the first battle of Mulinsk was their real full-fledged combat debut, and they did provide a good fighter escort at a cost-effective price for the Lardies, but some pilots found them a little challenging to learn and fly, and like a lot of V-stall craft, they have their curve, they really do. But considering it fit the need quickly, wasn't half bad. So, in this mode, it doesn't really seem clear how these could operate from an acclimator, but actually up to 156 could be squeezed into one for deployment. Again, thanks to the S-foil system. The wings have 2 primary positions, slanted down, also in the complete horizontal, depending on the need. But for landing and fitting, the tail We go up. And for further compactness, the wings folded up. This would make vertical landings much easier. And as long as you have a room with a relatively tall ceiling in a spacecraft, now it's quite narrow. So you can hang these up in racks quite well. So yes, even though the acclimator wasn't initially designed to carry the V-19 Torrent, it didn't require much retrofitting of the larger ships themselves. So it actually fit the bill better than it had any right to. So with the V-19, our loyal and brave clones have a fighter, interceptor, but it is short-ranged. And while it does have ordnance launchers, this is not a fighter bomber by any stretch of the imagination. The missiles are anti-fighter, anti-droid at best. But it does give a good escort to the Lardies, which do have heavier ordnance, but they're not really that great in space, and, well, on atmosphere, you're pretty much there. And while the acclimator is well defended against droid fighters and similar sized ships, it doesn't have a really heavy hitting capability either. So, still in the first year of the war, the next step, we need a strike starfighter. So yet again, the Grand Army goes looking around to see what projects are already on the drawing board. And thus we come to another manufacturer and another design bureau, Consular Manufacturing. And this is the BTLB, better known as the Y-wing. Like the V-19, this was undergoing testing during the Battle of Geonosis. It wasn't quite as far along, though. And it was designed with the clones in mind, at least towards the latter stages of development. And it was designed as a long-range fighter, fighter-bomber, scout, reconnaissance, or even armed passenger, VIP transport. So, quite a multi-role ship she was. And quite famous in history, especially with later variants and versions. But in the beginning, this was something that the Grand Army needed desperately, because after Geonosis, word got out, and thanks to missing fleets, it was well known that the Separatists had a new super weapon, which turned out to be the Malevolence Dreadnought. It needed to be hit, and hit hard, and knocked out. A V-19 had neither the hitting power nor the range or endurance to do it, and the acclimator would have been too big of a target. And obviously the Lardy was very ill-suited for that. So the first squadron was really put together out of prototype and pre-production BTLBs and used to hit the Malevolence, and after some back and forth would eventually win out, which would immediately lead to the formation of 2 more squadrons, and this would be the preeminent fighter bomber for the majority of the Clone War. So what is the Y-wing? She's about 23.5 meters long, so not small, and about 8.5 meters wide, although she is quite flat. She's powered by 2, powerful Consular engines. She has her own reactor and power cells, cryogenic cells for energy, because she does need a lot. She's not all that fast, because she's rather heavy. In an atmosphere, she can't even quite do 1,000 clicks. In space, she's a little sluggish to get there, but she makes up for it. For one, she's got titanium reinforced Durasteel armor. No lightweight there, and quite a bit of it, especially around the neck area and the engines. She also has a respectable shield generator. And because she's designed for long-range strike missions, and because she really couldn't operate effectively from acclimators, she had a Class 2 hyperdrive. Not the fastest in the world, but far from the slowest. For that day and time, it was actually a marvel of engineering to fit a Class 2 hyperdrive in something this small. In addition, she had a respectable bomb load. She had 2 ordnance launchers, each capable of carrying 6 proton torpedoes, and they could be retrofit for other ordnance too, but they're mainly there for the protons. She could also carry some proton bombs for atmosphere missions, because everyone knows there's no gravity in space, correct? Every basic 1-year-old clone would know that. We like to call those young clones Orions. And for her defense, we have 2 Tamenbach laser cannons. 2 different versions were used, the IX-4 or the KX-5, very similar. And on top of that, we have a pair of light turreted ion cannons on top here. Ion cannons are very good for taking down shields and knocking out electronics without destroying the hull around them. So we have a total of 4 energy weapons plus our bombs. And on top of that, we have a crew of 3 in total. Pilot, of course. Co-pilot / gunner. Also weapons officer. And, last but not least, an astromech droid. And yes, he's actually full-sized. He's in charge of operating the hyperdrive, storing coordinates, calculating jumps, that kind of thing. Also making repairs and beeping and booping. And for its day and time, this had very good long-range sensors. It also had early threat and early warning sensors. It had very quick target acquisition and scanning abilities when it would jump into an area. And it had, for the time, a very advanced targeting computer. In fact, so advanced that a version of it would be used for the next 3 decades. So, it's one thing to have a good bomb load, but if you can't get them on target, not so good. Now, this was still slow and lumbering. It would take hits. But it was easier for novice pilots to fly, and thanks to the shields and armor, and the ability to jump out with the hyperdrive, it was designed to take a few hits while it was delivering its payload. For, its day and time, it was actually a very effective strike aircraft. And in the very beginning, the first year or 2 of the war, Consular could not make enough of these for the Republic. And they would stay in service until after the end of the conflict and the rise of the Empire, of course. But not for long, because needs changed. But this was definitely the right spacecraft for the time early in the war, when we were still making do. Speaking of making do, let's revisit our Corellian friends now, because we've mostly been talking about fighters, with our only larger capital ship still the Acclimator. The Corellian Consular Cruiser, sometimes referred to as the Republic Cruiser, also sometimes referred to as the C-70. This was in service with the Judicial Branch and Diplomatic Corps well before the Clone Wars. In fact, some sources claim it served as many as 30 years before. It's a classic Corellian design, not too big and bulky, but enough. About 115 meters long. Quite flat. We have 3 large, powerful engines that give it decent acceleration for its mass. In atmosphere, it can go about 900 kph, but of course in space, it can kind of get up and going much better. has a Class 2 hyperdrive, which actually was considered quite good for its day and time for its diplomatic missions, with a Class 14 backup. While it had shielding, it initially had no weapons. Initial crew was typically 9, and it would originally carry 16 to 24 passengers in rather good comfort level. But during the war, these would continue to be built and also retrofit, and they would primarily fill 2 roles: light cruiser and frigate. As a light cruiser, they would often be fitted with 4 turbo laser batteries and given installations for kind of mobile command posts, coordination posts. Also, their troop carrying ability was expanded first to 24, then 30, and then more troop clones who don't mind getting close. And other systems were installed. As a frigate, they would have the turbo lasers, plus they would get 2 ordnance launchers for torpedoes or maybe even heavy rockets. They would also still kind of do their escort convoy missions as well as fast diplomatic missions, getting people that need to go somewhere in a hurry safely. And they could land in many other larger ships as well as on planets and other installations. A very flexible craft overall, and a very solid, upgradable, long-lived product from Corellian Engineering, but not as much as our next one. As a evolution of the design and a bit of a sister ship, we have the Corvette. Although its initial naming system was CR-70, that would evolve into the CR-90 here. The CR-70 wasn't much larger than the C-70 at about 120 meters, and like the C-70, it was unarmed. But it was fast, with 11 smaller but more powerful engines. It gave it much better redundancy and still a better top speed. In space, it had quite good acceleration, and in atmosphere, it could get up to nearly 1,000 kph, so better than some fighters. It still had a Class 2 hyperdrive, although it was a very modular, upgradable design, so many users would upgrade that. It typically had a standard crew of 30, although some missions would demand more, and it needed at least 7 to operate, and it could carry up to about 170 passengers, although in emergency situations or troop transporting, it could even do more. Now, I'm really talking more about the CR-90 because they do kind of evolve into one. It was even larger at about 150 meters long. So, yeah. During the war, the CR-70 would be given up to 4 turbo laser installations. And the CR-90, which always had guns for defense, would be given a few ranges of weapons. Sometimes it would be given 2 heavy turbo lasers, 1 dorsal, 1 ventral, and then 4 somewhat lighter turbo lasers. Other versions would actually have 6 heavy, or other versions would have quad laser cannon installations in more anti-fighter role. Again, it was a very modular, very flexible ship, both externally and internally. So these were retrofit into cruisers, frigates, escorts, even some were made into light starship starfighter carriers with a bit of a grafted on external bay or external docking ports to carry a small detachment of light fighters for long-range missions. So these definitely did serve and were better than nothing. And while they tried to retrofit vessels from Naboo and other core worlds, they just weren't well suited. These were tough, dependable, and cost-effective designs with good redundancy built in. So, they would make up the bulk of the larger ship fleet for the first year of the war, alongside the acclimator. But everything we've looked at now, with the exception of maybe a couple, were either retrofits or rush jobs. As the war progressed, well, needs would change and the clones would come into more of their own, and the Grand Army would really figure out what they needed and didn't need. So with that, let's kind of move into the second generation. To students of Imperial history, or for just those who like pulp hollow novels, it should come as no surprise yet again that the peace-loving Jedi were really the first to update and upgrade and increase the lethality of their Delta-7 Aethersprite Interceptor fighter. This is the Delta-7B Bravo variant, retroactively making the original the Delta-7A. This would appear in the first year of the Clone War, after the Battle of Geonosis, but they were starting to come out and be issued through the temple before the Battle of Yulin. So, it's not a major improvement. However, we do have a full-size astromech relocated to the center, and we have a slightly thicker, more robust hull with slightly better armor. This allows it to carry slightly more energy, fuel, water to extend its duration away from its docking ring to about 6 hours without rationing, up from 5. We still have 4 turbo lasers, but they're a slightly more powerful variant. Also an ordnance launcher, typically concussion missiles or micro proton torpedoes, is more common, although not necessarily standard fit. And it is ever so slightly faster with more robust uprated engines. It can do 10-20 kph more in atmosphere, but in space it has noticeably better acceleration. Essentially, the original Delta-7 would be taken out of production, and as they were lost in the field, they would be substituted for the Delta-7B here, because in most every way except for overall weight, it was a better craft, more capable, certainly better for a wartime footing. But it was a modest update, but again, put into the field quite quickly. It was standard issue, but some Jedi, especially those mechanically inclined, are just, ones that liked hot rods, would customize theirs. As just one example, we have a model of Knight, later Master Anakin Skywalker's customized Delta-7B. For, again, fans of history, Imperials often consider him the one good Jedi. In fact, Lord Vader's biography of him is quite glowing. One might wonder where he got his sources. At any rate, it does show this was upgradable. We do have 4 lasers, but they're more powerful. They're also mounted outboard. An ordnance launcher is standard on here, with up to 16 micro torpedoes and a rapid fire system. We have improved aerodynamics and atmosphere with different strakes and moving surfaces. And perhaps most importantly, this is the first time a small-scale fighter has a hyperdrive internally assembled. This would not have been cost-effective to mass-produce, but it required a lot of customization and hand-fitting and time in the hyperdrive system. 2 engines linked together was a bit finicky, but when it worked, it was quite fast and allowed them to not have to rely on the rings. As you might imagine, a good thing. And this actually shows you why some Jedi would continue using the Delta-7 even through the end of the war and the beginning of their treachery. It had its assets. Of course, it had its drawbacks. And still, yet again, these are pretty much made by Kuat just for the Jedi Temple, but are standard issue as such and seen throughout the Clone War and are mass-produced. But what about our blue boys in white? They deserve an upgrade too, right? Used by good guys and bad guys for decades, there are a few galactic starfighters as easily recognizable as the Z-95, or as those in the Rishi maze say, Z-95, also known as the Headhunter. And here we have a new company, Incom, who had actually been courting the Republic for years with this design proposal, maybe as far back as the Battle of Naboo, hard to say. But the Republic, in its wisdom, was not interested, that is, until after the Battle of Geonosis. Yes, the V-19 Torrent was a good stopgap, and it would continue to serve for the first half of the Clone Wars, but something more well-rounded, more multi-role was needed. The initial concept design proposal was given the company name of Onyx Star, but once the Grand Army of the Republic ordered it, it was classified as the Z-95 Cloner C variant. And it has what have become rather identifiable Incom lines here. This is not a tiny fighter, but not huge. Smaller than a Y-wing. It's about 16 meters by 18 meters wide. And at first it might seem underwhelming, but it's easily adaptable, infinitely upgradable, which is what kept the design relevant for a decade until the Grand Army came along and needed it, and quite redundant and forgiving to fly. It does have shielding, and it does have decent hull armor. It also has a decent computer targeting system, although not as advanced as the Y-wings. We have 2 medium lasers mounted outboard on the wings. The wings are fixed in the horizontal position. Some versions are also fitted with an external potted ion cannon for special work. And most all versions have dual concussion missile launchers with 3 missiles each, and the clone version could often carry additional ordnance, bombs, or missiles under the wings on pylon stations. Crew of 1 as usual. No astromech. We have 4 engines for redundancy and speed. In an atmosphere, this is capable of about 1150, maybe 1200 kph in the hands of the right pilot. And in space, it has a respectable acceleration. So a little slower than the Delta 7, but on par or slightly faster than the V-19. And considering it's a larger craft with more powerful laser cannons and engines, power plant makes sense. So the clones started to fly these in kind of the second phase of the war, around 21 BBY, which actually allowed the V-19 to be kind of cycled out to reserve units and planetary defense units, and this became more of a frontline clone starfighter in the second year of the war. It was, like I said, easy to fly, easy to mass produce, cost effective. They even would eventually make a hyperdrive equipped version called the Z-95T, but since there was not a astromech, the jump coordinates had to be pre-programmed in at base, meaning the mission couldn't be all that flexible. But those were not common. Typically the clone versions would operate from carriers and other large ships. but it was a good atmospheric dogfighter too, and far less convoluted than the Torrent. And again, a very iconic ship that has served hero and villain alike, but you know, don't hate the hardware. One of the narrator's personal favorites too. So, now that we have our space superiority role updated, what about the ground attack, the assault role? We've been relying on the Lardy quite a bit. Often deployed by GRA special forces, this might not at first be recognizable to casual historians. Meet the new class gunship, assault ship, attack shuttle, often known as the Republic Assault or Attack Shuttle. Developed by yet another company, Cygnus Spaceworks. And this, in a lot of ways, is designed to complement the Lot gunship, but not to replace it. The Lot had good lift capabilities, was very affordable to maintain, could fit on board the Acclimator quite well, but very short range, but very limited space abilities. And while it was heavy on the offense, it wasn't the best armored or shielded. This design was actually on the drawing boards during the Battle of Geonosis and would soon enter into prototype stage, and then would go into pre-production late in 22 BBY, and we would see full production models in late year or 21 BBY. And in a lot of ways, it takes nods from other starships like the V-19 Torrent, combining them with the Lot. This was designed for long-range deployment and is more of a shuttle than the Lot. Overall length is about 19 meters, and like the V-19, we have variable geometry wings for landing on a planet. And for flight mode, we have a few different positions we can use. If this seems like the modern shuttles we know at our local spaceports, that's because Cygnus would use this as the basis for an entire series, including the T4s. But yeah, this had a crew of 2, pilot, co-pilot. It had either 2 medium heavy lasers and 2 light lasers, or 6 light lasers for defense. So a couple of different configurations there. And it could carry 30 troops. So that might sound like it has the same carriage ability as the Lot, but it doesn't, because that's just 30 troops. The Lot I could carry 30 plus speeder bikes and other equipment, even a med droid. This could not. It was just 30 armed troops, not really any extra room for extras. However, it did have the immense benefit of seats. So, yeah. And that's because it was designed for long-range missions. It was fitted with a hyperdrive, and it was reasonably fast in an atmosphere, at least compared to the Lot. Do that in a minute. The Lot was not even quite capable of reaching 630 clicks. This could do at least 850. So, for shuttle, attack ship, whatever, not bad. It even had an escape pod system for the crew. So it could go out, operate far from a ship or base, because at this time we're still limited on large capital ships. So if you needed a strike mission, a special forces mission, load up troops. This could deliver them. Didn't quite have the heavy hitting power of the lot, but it could protect them with 4 to 6 lasers. And it did have more powerful shielding and thicker, stronger armor, so it could take more of a beating, which, considering it's going to operate in smaller numbers further from home, that's a good idea. So, way to go, Cygnus. So a nice, specialized, configurable ship for Republic commandos and other spec ops clones, really bearing into their Mandalorian heritage. Obviously, these would cost more to make and maintain than the lot and were of more specific roles, so that's why I said a minute ago that this was not ever meant to replace it. It was meant to work alongside. And it could also operate alongside strike vessels like the Y-wing, anything with a hyperdrive. Made in much smaller numbers, it was still very useful during the Clone Wars and would serve throughout them. And again, kind of paved the way for more peaceful time shuttles for transport. So with that, we've mentioned a fighter, an attack shuttle, but as I said, we're kind of needing a capital ship. We've stretched the acclimator about as far as it could go as a medium to heavy assault cruiser, and we're getting more and more fighters, which didn't exist when it was initially drafted. So, in the middle of the Clone Wars, we got one of the most iconic vessels of all time for the Republic and for the Empire. At last we come to the Venator cruiser, the first vessel worthy of the name Star Destroyer, and a direct forebearer to the current ISDs that defend us to this very day. While the acclimator certainly has the beginnings and can be considered the grandfather, this is the direct father to our Imperial Star Destroyers, and in many ways is superior, believe it or not. Oh shit, I said that. Anyway, the acclimator was primarily a troop transport, able to carry up to 16,000 clones. And it could carry over 150 fighters of the smaller variant, or up to 80 lot gunships. But that wasn't its primary capability. It also had good, but somewhat limited, offensive abilities. This sought to correct and complement that. Designed by Lyra Blissex, daughter/wife of the designer we already talked about. It's a long story. This was a command cruiser, often called a Jedi cruiser, and meant to be a flagship, a fleet command vessel, and a carrier. Now that we have the V-19 as well as the Z-95 and Y-wing, we need something to carry them around, repair, refurbish them, and the acclimator just isn't cutting it. So the Venator was introduced. These were on the drawing boards even before the Clone Wars began, but were not ready for service by Geonosis. The first time they appeared in combat, earliest days, would be the first battle of Christophsis, and they would very quickly become the backbone of the fleet, the Grand Army of the Republic, the Navy, everything, and they were a very good multi-purpose craft. Yes, they were primarily a carrier, but they had more to offer. At over 1,100 meters long and over 500 meters wide and nearly 300 meters tall, this is considerably larger than the acclimator, We also have 2 bridge and command sets here. They are cross-linked. If one is knocked out, the other can perform both duties. But under typical operations, the port side is fighter control, and the starboard side is ship control and operations. We have a total of 10 engines, primary, secondary, and tertiary, which give it a top speed and atmosphere of almost 1,000 kph. Considering its size, not bad. It also has very respectable acceleration in space. It has a Class 1 hyperdrive with a Class 12 backup, so while not quite as good as the Acclimator, again, quite respectable. For weapons, we have 8 heavy dual turbo laser installations, complemented with 2 medium dual turbo laser installations. That doesn't sound so impressive yet, but we have a total of 4 torpedo launchers, each with 16 torpedoes ready to go. That's a good assault in the nose for delivering an offensive strike. On top of that, we have 52 point defense laser systems, so more than double that of the Acclimator. And on top of that, we have multiple smaller laser batteries. We also have ion cannon. The number does vary. And we even have deck guns, because we have a large deck. In fact, the initial Venator Mark I here had nearly half a kilometer of bay that could open up to rapidly deploy its fighters. This could carry 192 V-19 Torrents, as well as at least 40 lot gunships, and with room for next generation fighters and other support craft. Plenty of bay room there. She also had reinforced and redundant shielding, as well as reinforced hull armor, so she could stand the fight longer, and full repair crews. Total crews, including her flight crews, of about 7,400 on board. So a very effective carrier, but in no way inferior to the Imperial Star Destroyer, I promise, even though it's a better carrier. But it is not as good of a troop transport as the Acclimator, which kept them not only in frontline service, but production. This could carry up to 2,000 troops in the Mark I version here. So not bad, but it was definitely geared more towards fighters. And it was a very multi-role and very flexible craft, so it was soon joined by the Venator Mark II. Here we have it here. Size-wise, it's about the same. Really, the changes are internal. Rearranging allowed for better storage capacity, more compatibility with newer weapons systems, newer fighters. The huge open half-kilometer bay is actually shrunk down a wee bit, but that's to make better internal storage and more flexibility, and it still has a very large bay. It's also the first to introduce the ventral bay system that appears to this very day on our Victory and Imperial destroyers down here with quick launch capability. So it gave up the large side bay. It still has one, and it also gained a bottom bay. This did complicate landing a bit. Typically the Mark IIs would stay in space. The Mark Is and 2s could both land on a planet. Typically a landing strip or smoothed out pad needed to be created. And if so, they could come in, glide down landing, and essentially open up and act as a de facto base of operations on the planet with wide open areas. This would actually lead to the prefab garrison facilities we would find on the Imperial Star Destroyer later, since the ISD cannot land on a planet. In fact, the Venator Mark II was really the last capital ship and Star Destroyer with that ability. Even it, because of this ventral bay, wasn't ideally suited. But yes, this was the backbone of the fleet, and pretty much every major group in the Navy would have one or more of these at its heart, and many were commanded by Jedi generals and supported by Jedi commanders, as well as standard Republic Navy officers. Unlike the Acclimator, which is almost all clones all the time, these were still mostly clones, but they had a much higher number of standard humans on board, because after a year of fighting, they're starting to kind of get the hang of it, and this is also when politics plays a role. While some, like Wilhelm Tarkin, earned their rank, others did not. Looking at you, Nita. But yes, iconic and used in large numbers by 21 BBY. In fact, 1,000 Venators were present in 19 BBY at the Battle of Coruscant. Now, to be fair, these were more reserve units or new units, so their performance was less than desirable, but they still did the job, and it does show us the massive construction program undertaken here by Kuwat and many subcontractors and licensed producers. Goes to show you, the Republic was ill prepared for war, but once the machine started going, it started off slow, but then it ramped up thanks to good leadership at the top and the prescience of Chancellor Palpatine. And these would continue to serve into the Imperial era for a number of years, being used as training cruisers, police cruisers, and patrol ships, because they just they did well for operating large numbers of fighters coordinated out of, and they were very modular, flexible, and designed to last. And so this kind of gets us through that second generation of naval craft of the Clone Wars. So with that, let's move on to the pinnacle of performance and the treachery of the Jedi. And since we mentioned the space sorcerers, they would be next to get an updated fighter. This would actually be one of kind of a series of updates introduced in 20 BBY. Prototypes would be in 21 BBY, around the time the Venator was really getting into full issuance and use, which is why it was designed to accommodate these from the get-go. And the one good Jedi would fly in early production metal, and that would be at the Battle of the Veil Nebula. This is the Actus-class Eta-2 Light Interceptor, sometimes called the Jedi Interceptor, Jedi Starfighter. But unlike with previous Delta 7s, this is still considered part of the Delta series, still from Kuwat. This would actually be shared with the clones. In fact, a dedicated clone variant would be introduced in 19 BBY, with a few modifications to better suit their needs and preferences. As for the Jedi, this was a small, stripped-down, lightweight interceptor. While it is 4.3 meters wide, so slightly wider than the 7, it's much shorter at under 5.5 meters long. It's also still quite thin. It does have a better view with the canopy more up front. We have 2 engines. Some variants have 3. In atmosphere, it has a very impressive top speed of 1500 kph, and in space, Very good acceleration, very, very good maneuverability, agility. But it comes at the cost of armor and shielding, as in it has little armor and no shielding. This concerned some, while others didn't seem to mind, because they relied on its agility for defense. Take it or leave it. It was better armed than the Delta 7. We have 2 medium to heavy laser cannon, and then we also have 2 secondary ion cannon here. Those were modular. They could be pulled off to allow for fitment of an ordnance launcher. Due to its small size, it could carry 4 concussion missiles, or sometimes 2 proton torpedoes at most. It had rather basic sensors and nav systems. Some Jedi would even pull those out. It was, stripped down. One identifiable part, it used twin ion engines. Essentially, the early versions of what are in our TIE fighters to this very day, as is the basic canopy and plexiglass durasteel construction. And it does also accommodate, at least some versions, an astromech droid, full-sized, again, not cut down. 192 of these could easily fit on board the Venator carrier, along with older vessels or newer ones. Here we have another example in less flamboyant coloring, and this does not have the ion cannon, so presumably it has the optional ordnance launcher. Still has the primary lasers up front. Now, one thing about these lasers, even though they were powerful, they were prone to overheating, especially thanks to the craft's small size. To help with heat radiation and overall maneuverability, these did have S-foils of a sort on the sides here. And a skilled pilot could learn how to use these to their advantage. Also has the side effect of looking quite neat. But no. It was definitely there to radiate heat from the laser cannon system and to provide better maneuverability and engine cooldown aside. And these, of course, could land on a planet as well as a ship. And they very quickly went into mass production in 20 BBY because they are cheaper to produce than the Delta 7 and faster. And again, by 19 BBY, the clones themselves will start flying these. And while this still doesn't have an internal hyperdrive, we do have this. Another ring system, still from Seared. The Delta 7 used the Mark 31. This is an updated Mark 45 with redundancy built in. Still a Class 1 drive, but it has more resources and, docks in, giving it interstellar capability. If I can pull this out. But very tight. Of course, here's our craft. This one does have the ion cannon as well as lasers. However, the S-foils are permanently folded in. But hey, canopy still opens. Goes to show you just how small this was. Not much larger than the pilot and astromech themselves. But yeah, the ETA-2 was the newest Jedi, and as it would happen, thanks to the quick actions of our loyal clones, the last Jedi starfighter. But again, the clones themselves would fly these, although it had quite a steep learning curve. This would replace the Interceptor and, to some extent, Space Superiority Fighter, some of the V-19s and Z-95s, and a few other miscellaneous craft. So it does that one role very well. But it's very specialized. And like I said, it's only part of a new generation of craft that are coming in during the final stage of the war. The Y-wing was the primary strike starfighter, fighter-bomber, during the early stages of the war, and would hang on through the entirety. But in 21 BBY, especially getting into 20 BBY, it would begin to be replaced, at least in certain situations, by the ARC 170. This was Incom's response to Consular's Y-wing, and in a lot of ways is based on the same technology as seen in the Headhunter, but improved and enlarged. And this is quite a large bird, 14.5 meters by 22.5 meters. It's not ginormous, but it actually does have the largest crew of any fighter, total of 4. In tandem seating, we have pilot and co-pilot. Both have controls. Both can also function as bombardier or gunner. And in the rear, we have the tail gunner, who could also double as the sensor officer or jamming surveillance guy, just another guy. And then to top off the crew, we have an astromech droid, who is in charge of the Class 1.5 hyperdrive. This does have quite adequate shielding, quite strong, very thick armor. We have S-foils again to radiate heat and adjust flight trajectory, especially in an atmosphere. Large engines in the back. This isn't the fastest in the world, but it can easily exceed 1,000 clicks in atmosphere, so more than the Y-wing. And it also makes up for it by being able to take a hit, but can also deliver a hit. In the back, in this turret, we have 2 medium lasers. And in the front, we have 2 heavy lasers designed to punch through capital ship shielding. So they're good at that, medium and large targets. Not as good at fighters, if we're being honest. But that wasn't really the purpose of this. The nose houses an ordnance launcher. Standard load is 6 torpedoes, so not quite as good as the Y-wing, but still better than an average fighter. But most of this nose is taken up by long-range, very effective, very quick sensors, as well as electronic warfare equipment, jamming equipment, surveillance equipment, hence the name, the reconnaissance part of the name. This was part strike fighter, part reconnaissance craft, and just kind of part long-range mission. It could operate on its own, detached for a week with given supplies, and with a hyperdrive and a crew of 4, could almost deliver its own little strike mission. Almost. So yeah, Incom was already working on it in 22 BBY, prototypes in 21, and started to really appear in the fleet in 20. And the Venator could carry 36 of these as standard. Again, it's a relatively large craft, but it's a specialty craft. So, you know, you're not going to have wings of these. This is not a fighter. In fact, it would need escorting by a fighter, frankly. This is more of a AWACS or what have you. But for what it does well, and it really pushed technology forward. It had a very advanced targeting system, taking what the Z-95 started and pushing it further forward, and actually would lead to the system found in Incom's next release, which was promised to the Empire, but as traitors do, they gave it away to rebel scum. Nevertheless, this served the Republic well, and served the Empire for several years until newer, more advanced craft like the TIE Bomber came around. Very solid, robust, and allowed some of the venerable Y-wings to be retired or shifted to other positions. It really is the first dedicated reconnaissance, surveillance, electronic warfare starship we've had, and for its specialty did quite well. But as I said, it did need escorting. But first, let's kind of return to the beginning, the role of the Lardy, the Lot gunship. As I mentioned, the new class partially replaced it, but not fully. And one thing we're seeing is the war is changing, especially after the Battle of Coruscant in 19 BBY. The Separatist cowards are retreating to the Outer Rim, and so there are longer range, longer durance missions undertaken by the Grand Army of the Republic Navy. And so the needs are changing, and manufacturers are rightfully keeping up. The new class was still a shuttle, a troop transport, hyperdrive, shields, long range. During the war, it was supplemented by the Roe class, which featured a larger cargo module and a third wing on top. Certainly iconic of shuttles we recognize today. But around 20 BBY, Cygnus introduced their next adaptation, assault or attack shuttle, the Omicron class, sometimes nicknamed the Marauder. And this is just a further specialization for special forces, commando units, long endurance missions away from friendly lines. It was more self-sufficient and just better balanced. It had more agility and speed compared with previous versions. It can easily exceed 1,000 clicks, maybe 1,100. It has 2 heavy laser cannon in front. It has 2 turreted medium laser in the back. It can also be fitted, at least certain versions, with an ordnance launcher. It has a smaller crew carriage ability compared with the previous versions. It could comfortably house about 12 to 18 clones, more in a pinch, but yeah, it was meant for smaller, smarter operations, frankly. And that is very tight on this one. One moment, please. I guess better to be too tight than too loose. But yeah, this was a specialist attack shuttle. The unique shape to the wings, especially in atmosphere, acted as vortex generators, giving it very good agility for what it was. These were produced in much smaller numbers, but will continue on into the Imperial era for a very long time, perhaps up into current day and newer variants, which are still classified. And yes, it does have folding wings for landing or stowage on board a vessel. And that's really the most advanced attack shuttle viewed during the Clone Wars. Of course, it had shielding and an integrated hyperdrive system and more advanced automation for what it was. Just a general sleeker profile too. So with that, there's really just one left to talk about, isn't there? And it seems fitting our final craft tonight is another from Whalix Bliss Sex and from Kuwat, a loyal Imperial shipyard. This is the Alpha 3 Nimbus class V-wing. And this is still part of the Delta series, kind of the ultimate culmination of what Whalix has been working on. It's a little under 8 meters long and 4 meters wide, so quite small. Like the previous ones we've looked at, it has twin ion engines, a technology developed further into our fleet of TIE fighters today, giving it a very impressive top speed of over 1400 kph, nearly as fast as the Eta-2, and it's nearly as maneuverable, while at the same time having more systems. While it doesn't have life support, that's okay. Just like our TIEs, it's not necessary. Our pilots have them. It does, however, have shielding and a little bit more armor than the ETA. It has dual barrel rapid fire laser cannons, and it can be fitted with an optional ordnance launcher, although it's not standard. And we do have an astromech inside, although later Imperial versions would often do away with him. It could use the same Mark 45 hyperdrive ring as the ETA-2, and it was designed specifically to be an escort fighter, space superiority fighter, to escort the ARC 170 and older craft, as well as shuttles and attack assault ships. And for using the hyperdrive ring or just to stow itself on ships, our wings do fold up. In fact, when folded, the bottom act as the landing skid system, a good efficient use of parts. Simplicity is always good. And unlike the V-19 Torrent, that required some rather interesting finagling to fit the hyperdrive ring, this is nice and slim, easy to insert into one. And this would be the final major production starfighter of the Grand Army of the Republic and the Clone Wars. Early production models would appear in 20 BBY, but it was really the Battle of Coruscant in 19 BBY where this was issued en masse and really made a difference. Working alongside ETA-2s and escorting ARC 170s and protecting various assets, this made a difference. And so after that battle, the V-wing was kind of the new hot thing and was used for propaganda. Completely true, authentic publications to promote recruitment and support for the just war. And production would actually continue after the war, one of the few fighters to enjoy that, and this would serve the Empire for several years until enough TIE frontline fighters were available, and TIE interceptors for that matter. It was maneuverable, rapid fire lasers, didn't have the overheating problem of the ETA-2, could take a little bit more punishment thanks to the shielding, and could fit on board the current generation Mark 1 and Mark 2 Venators. In fact, they were built for it from the beginning. It replaced the V-19, and they were able to put 192 of those on board, up to 192 ETA-2s, and 36 ARC 170s, and roughly 40 lot gunships when fully maxed out, because these were quite light and designed intelligently, and just have a very mean, intimidating look to them. I'm sure droids were very intimidated, which is why, along with a few others, it continued for several years. And this really let older V-19s, even a good chunk of Z-95s, get retired out by the last year of the war, completely modernizing the fleet with this whole next generation. And all of these were designed during the war to specifically fight the separatists, and also to specifically kind of lean into the strengths of the Mandalorian clones. So with that, let's arrange these by generations and have some final thoughts, and we'll give some contact information at the end of this video if you would like to visit your local recruitment office. Here are the three distinct eras or generations of starship, starfighter of the Navy of the Grand Army of the Republic. As the name would suggest, primarily in the beginning, the focus is getting troops onto the ground, with space and high altitude combat secondary. After all, the Republic didn't ask for the war. They were the separatists that started it. So in the earliest generation, we have vessels that either existed before or were pressed into service within the first year, usually within the first weeks or months after the Battle of Geonosis. The second generation really were craft that were on the drawing board or even in the prototype stage before the war began, but not into production yet, and so they were able to integrate some lessons already being learned into them, but not fully. There was still a bit of an ad hoc feel, although not quite as severe as with the first generation. These would appear in either late 22 BBY or 21 BBY, so the early to mid part of the war. Finally, the third generation, we see a true step forward, and the Army really coming into its own along with the Navy. These are craft that were designed during the war specifically to fight the Separatist droid army, and really were built with the lessons learned, and also the changing battlefield. After all, the war in the beginning was very different from the war at the end. Some of these test flew in 21 BBY, but many did not until 20 or even 19 BBY, and that's usually when you start to see them in widespread service and issuance. And these were all built in large numbers, and by this point older pre-war vessels were retired or shifted to secondary planetary defense roles. I think it's very educational to see, and also see how the Empire has built upon this with our very cost-effective and very combat-effective TIE series. So, what do you think? Obviously, you know what you think. The Venator-class, sometimes considered a proto-Star Destroyer, could have offensive abilities. After all, it had 4 ordnance launchers and heavy turbo lasers and point defense lasers. But the storage racks for the tubes were of limited capacity. And while it was fast, it wasn't the most heavily armored. And it was designed to operate in an atmosphere, and therefore there had to be concessions towards that. Useful, of course. And as we've already discussed, during the war, there never was a better troop transport. But there would end up being better starships and cruisers. The Venator, the Mark I, took that and changed the focus from troops to starfighters, and also multi-role purposes, heavy equipment delivery, more offensive ability with larger batteries in the front, a very flexible hangar deck system, and better facilities for command and control coordination with 2 complete operation centers. And this would be designed for the first and second generation of starfighters and other heavy equipment. Soon it would be supplemented by the Mark II, which was designed for the last generation of Clone War fighters, and it was an even more flexible design, and a design more based on being a space superiority cruiser and less of one intended to land on a planet. Just further refining. Both had strengths and weaknesses compared to each other, but it does show the changing nature of the war. Planetary assaults, close range early on, to more long-range patrol and attack as we chase the Separatists down into their holes after the Battle of Coruscant. So these 3 formed the backbone of the fleet. Yes, older retrofit Corellian cruisers and corvettes were always there, as well as a few other frigates. But when it comes to capital ships, cruisers, destroyers, the Acclimator and Venator did the heavy lifting. And speaking of, we have the shuttles and transports. Early on, the Lot gunship, the I and the C variants, they were called upon to do a lot, and they answered the call very well. These weren't even true spacecraft with true engines. They were actually repulsor craft. So, very short range, almost an atmosphere-only craft. But thanks to forward-thinking designs, they had enough innovations to keep them going, and a very heavy firepower and quite a heavy lift capability. And they really had to. That's what was in the beginning available for the clones from Rothana Heavy Engineering. But of course that would give way as Cygnus would come in and really make a name for themselves, designing a whole myriad of shuttles, many of which we enjoy today. The new class was the first semi-autonomous long-range hyperdrive-equipped shuttle, still capable of delivering a good number of troops into combat, as well as covering them, although not quite as heavily armed as the Lodi. And of course that would give way to the Omicron towards the end of the war, which was essentially an attack shuttle that really wanted to be a large starfighter. Still had good lift capability and good defense capability, even some offense capability, not to mention it's probably the most attractive looking to us. But it was more of a specialized and a lower production item. Speaking of starfighters, in the very beginning at the Battle of Geonosis, we had none. Thankfully, Corporal came through in a pinch, delivering the V-19 Torrent, often overlooked today as newer and better fighters came along. In the early days, when we were fighting a defensive war against aggression, it held the line and did more than it had any right to when it was called upon. A little complicated, a little large in some areas, it was nevertheless very versatile and could carry ordnance as well as having 2 reasonably heavy laser cannon. Though it had a bit of a threshold to learn how to fly, once our clones got the hang of it, they could do some very interesting things with it. And unlike the Lot gunship, it could be retrofit to use a docking ring for hyperdrive travel, although this was never ideal. It really needed to operate from larger ships like the Acclimator, and thankfully they could be modified for it, and thankfully the first generation of Venators were made specifically for the Torrent fighter. But it was the beginning, and it would lead to the next series. And we really have 2, a heavy fighter bomber and the version of the BTLB Y-wing, and a multi-role, multi-purpose medium-sized fighter in the guise of the Z-95 Headhunter from Incom. Both complemented each other very well, and still left room for the V-19 in its light interceptor role. After all, it would fit on board ships that neither of these would because of their larger size and more requirements. But with the Y-wing early in the war, the Republic had a strike capability, and so it was able to knock out large capital ship threats like the Malevolence. Before that, we had nothing. And really thanks to the one good Jedi, it was deployed effectively and then handed over to the clones who made good use of it with their nerves of steel. They were able to stay on target and did not eject and deliver their payload, sometimes at great personal cost, but theirs is not the reason why, correct? Correct. And of course, this would serve through the war and have several variants. The Z-95, while lighter than it, is still heavier than the Torrent, and was more adaptable to relatively heavy laser cannon, ordnance strapped under the wing pylons, in addition to light launchers in the nose. And also in the nose we have long-range sensors and early electronic jamming and warfare equipment. Just a good, well-rounded craft, although in the beginning, as a general rule, it did not have hyperdrive capability, and for the most of the Clone War would not. That said, good speed, good armor, good shields. It was a good stopgap and jack of all trades, if perhaps master of none. And of course we come to the Jedi, the Delta 7 ether sprites. Most pre-war fighters did not make it far into the GAR, but because the Jedi were generals, commanders, trusted leaders, they would deploy their vessels in large numbers, and as we talked about, even be allowed to customize them, something that no self-respecting clone or stormtrooper would ever dream of doing. So many warning signs when we look back, but then again, hindsight is 20/20, correct? So this would be in service throughout the war, and did give a fighter interceptor ability with hyperdrive capability, ring or not. These were designed for it, so they were very compatible, and somewhat long-range endurance missions. Also, their long-range comms and very long-range and skilled sensor systems were beneficial for the reconnaissance role. Although their relatively light lasers, light armor, and light shielding meant that unless the pilot was very skilled at avoiding getting hit, they would not last long in combat. So it was not really a true combat craft so much as it was a sleek hot rod craft, but then again, that's what the Jedi preferred. Not a major difference between the Delta 7A and Delta 7B. Slightly more hull armor on the wartime version, slightly more range endurance, and the ability to integrate a true astromech droid. But Introduced early in the war, it was a good step up from Kuat, a name we know and trust to this very day in the Empire. And of course it would lead to the next full series of clone starfighters. It is interesting and very forward-thinking that these craft were designed to work together. The ARC 170, the V-wing, and the Eta-2. The ARC 170 took over the role of reconnaissance from the Delta 7. Also, maybe some special ops missions when only 3 were needed from various other ships. And of course, some bombing missions, especially long-range, long-endurance from the Y-wing. In fact, the 170 would have some of the most long-range self-endurance possible. But while it could punch through medium and heavy shielding and armor and defend itself from the rear decently, it was not a dogfighter. It did not have forward-facing guns intended for that. It carried a limited number of missiles or torpedoes. Usually it was fitted with torpedoes. And though it was reasonably fast for its size, it was somewhat unmaneuverable. Thus, we needed and got the V-wing Interceptor. This was a slim and trim ship. Rapid-fire cannons, ordnance launchers, able to operate from carriers, starbases, moons, planets, anywhere. Self-contained life support with the pilot himself allowed it to not use its own power for that, and to provide for a more effective ejection system besides. This really was the culmination, what was needed to fight quick and nimble droid fighters, and of course disposable droid fighters at that. Slow and heavily armored just wouldn't cut it. Speed and skill and rapid fire weaponry, those were the key. And so, beginning with the Battle of Coruscant and afterwards, at the last stages of the war, these would operate in large numbers, escorting carriers and other larger craft. And like the Delta 7, these are still part of the Delta series, they were designed to use a hyperspace docking ring. In fact, the same ring system is their sister ship here, the Eta-2. The V-wing was a fighter interceptor. The Eta-2 was considered a light interceptor. It did things. In the hands of a skilled pilot, it could perform, or rather outperform, any other starfighter. Republic, clone, separatist droid, anything. Very small, very compact, very powerful weapons for its size. It had its own limitations, but these were known and accepted by its pilots. And for the first time, clones were allowed to fly these special planes originally meant only for the elite Jedi. And this was definitely a dedicated space superiority fighter. No bombing capability, no shielding, very light armor. It took what the V-wing was doing and ramped it up more. So only the most skilled clones and later skilled Imperial pilots would fly the Eta-2. But in their hands, it was unparalleled. And again, it could use the updated hyperspace ring to give it some autonomy. And this is why these made up the backbone of the fighter fleet of the Galactic Empire for its first half-decade or so. It's a telling thing that these all stuck around for years afterwards, even during peacetime, when our Emperor wisely redesignated funds towards rebuilding and the arts and hunting down, of course, the Jedi. So that's our generations. Which is your favorite? And what's the worst Separatist droid craft and Rebel Alliance craft? Yes, I know they're all junkers, but still. Fun can be had by all. Ha ha. Pip pip. Well, I thought I would do something different. But have done quite a few videos recently on real-world aircraft, and I thought it would be fun to talk about this in a real-world perspective, in universe, a little bit in character, and also a little bit tongue-in-cheek. I don't know, just having fun, doing something a little lighter as it finally does cool off out here. So, let's go back, wrap it up, have some final thoughts. I don't know. Why not? I'm not an actor, you can tell, and I never aspired to be, but just having fun. Maybe I should have not tried this completely sober, but I did. Oh well. I don't know. Nothing really new to show you here. Most of these, as you know, are either from the old Titanium series. A couple in the video have been from the new Titanium series, and we have some from Hot Wheels, especially newer ships. But, I don't know, so it's kind of always fun to rehash. So what are my thoughts? Just, to wrap this up, getting out of character. So, just at the beginning of mentioning something I always had to bring up. Why does no one do an acclimator? It is such a major part of Attack of the Clones and subsequent media. Again, I had to get this one off a board game. At least it's kind of the right size, but it's plastic, not die-cast. In fact, it's the only non-die-cast I have, but I had to have an acclimator. I just did. It's too important. I don't know. The De Agostini line never did one. The original Titanium did not. The Black Series has not. Hot Wheels has not. Almost makes me wonder if there's some kind of weird rights thing, like the person that came up with this design. But those all should have been in the Star Wars license. So I don't know. The only acclimators you see are like the old Micro Machines Action Fleet. They did one towards the end of their run. Of course, that was just plastic, not die-cast. And I don't even know if the new, what do they call it? The new miniatures line that's kind of like the Action Fleet. I don't know if they're doing an acclimator. I don't get it. It's a neat-looking ship, and people love Star Destroyers, so this is the first Star Destroyer, even though it wasn't one. So yeah, this is a bit of a placeholder in my collection, but happy to have it, and it didn't cost much. The acclimator. If anyone knows, that's bugged me for years. One we do get enough of, and what might be my favorite Star Wars ship, maybe, the Venator Star Destroyer. I actually have a few of these. This one is from the newer Hot Wheels, as you can tell. And this one's from the old Titanium. I actually have two of these. One in Republic paint and one in Imperial paint. I can't see the difference, but it still makes me happy in my head. And, these were like $10, so why not? I believe the Hot Wheels is actually a little bigger. And what's nice is they're both almost solid metal because of their design. And I do like that they are slightly different looking. It's probably just accidental. But this one doesn't really have the ventral bay patterned out. And this one definitely does. So that's why I kind of make this my Mark II. And this is my Mark I. In reality, the whole Mark II, Mark I thing is just because different animations and different appearances. Which makes sense, though. That's how the real world works. Even sister ships in a class in a real Navy often have minor variations. But no, I'm happy to have these. I mean, this one was inexpensive. Although I think today they're going crazy. And these have been weird. I've seen these go up and down on eBay. I luckily found a store that still had some in stock, an online store. So I paid retail price, thank God, for both of my color schemes. I think there's a third color I don't have. Neither of them have action features. Thankfully, by this point, the Titanium series had dropped action features. They tried that with the initial ones and like the Phantom Menace and original trilogies, but yeah, both have kind of pros and cons. But I just know it's one of my favorite designs. The screws, I was gonna say they're a little more hidden on the Hot Wheels, but I don't know. They're both, exposed screws, but it's okay. Yeah, really do like these. I'd love to see a large-scale version in the Hot Wheels Select series. They did a Imperial Star Destroyer and ISD, so come on, let's do a Venator. Again, I know I'm not the only one who really likes that ship. And this is one I have way too many of, but some of them I didn't mean to get. The Lot ship here, these are different versions. I think I have another Hot Wheels in the all silver commemorative, and then I have many of these old titaniums, different paint schemes, but I only have one of the current Black Series titanium. When I say current, I think they've quit doing those now, but it was current, and it is a different mold for once. The reason I had so many of these, a couple were just given to me, a couple came in lots, and some of them came new in like sets. They would have 5 or 6 ship sets, and I wanted other ships in, so I kind of ended up with a few. The way I actually ended up with this one, it was shipped to me accidentally. Well, I bought one, and the guy thought it was a titanium, and I got it in, it was a Hot Wheels, and it wasn't really worth shipping back, so he just refunded me, and I kept it. It didn't have a stand with it, but I put a different stand with it. Each one of them kind of has pros and cons. Obviously, the Hot Wheels does have the ball turrets, and the doors in the closed position. Also, the screw heads are reasonably well concealed. They're on the underside. It's a little bit lighter weight, a little bit smaller scale compared to this. This one's probably the heaviest. But it has the open doors. I really wish they would move. It's kind of strange to just have them only in the open position. Also, the way they did the screws on the side, even to me who can't see, is a bit ugly. Looks good from this side, but on this side, you've got big screws on the side. Why didn't they do them on the bottom? I mean, I'm sure there's a technical reason, but it's a stupid one. They obviously could do them on the bottom with a little more forethought. They should have. I think some of these have opening canopies, but this one seems stuck, so I don't know. And of course, the guns are oversized on these. They're kind of rubbery. The rest of the ship is metal. Not a bad little lot, but yeah, the screws on the side and the guns, the doors, fixed in the back position kind of make me go meh. And a little bit more internal. I know these were pretty bare inside in the first place, but maybe some, well, they really didn't do troops on these. As I said, maybe some speeder, but I don't know, it's just kind of plain in there. I think opening doors would have really made this one better. It's kind of my least favorite, which is funny because I have the most of them. On the other hand, the updated Black Series is kind of my most favorite. It's a little bit smaller again, and the wings, the ratios are a little different. That's okay. Between animation and the show and the different movies, these have appeared different ways. It has much finer laser turrets in the front, and they do have some pivot to them. And I really like that the back one is much finer, not a big bulbous thing. The guns are a little more defined on, or the launchers on top. The doors are closed. They don't open, but I think it looks much better. It's kind of buttoned up like this. And you'll notice no screws on the side. And whereas the Hot Wheels, they put the screws on the bottom, which isn't bad. This one, they didn't. It's like they went from just screws everywhere on the original titanium to very, very well concealed on this one. I wish all of them did. Whoever designed this, I think it's Hasbro, really must have liked the Lot gunship because they did a good job with it. Doesn't have the ball turrets, but then again, the Hot Wheels, is the one they did. But yeah, I think this is my favorite, even if it's a little smaller. I like that the guns are more proportional, have a little bit of movement to them. I believe the screws are actually inside the cockpit here, so they use that to cover them. I don't know. Maybe they just didn't screw anything together. Just one big chunk. But no, I really like the lot gunship. I always have. And it definitely was important in the Clone Wars. And in the real world, this was kind of designed to be like a Hind helicopter, a Mi-24 or similar. You know, both heavy armament and ability to carry a couple of dozen troops and some speeder bikes. So, yeah, of course you kind of see that influence everywhere from the real world. And since we talked about the Lardies, let's go ahead and finish up with the attack shuttles. This one, the Republic, sorry, this is out of my mind. This, the Republic one, I believe this was just in the animated Clone Wars. I don't think it was in the live action. Definitely you start to see elements of the later Imperial shuttle, the Lambda, which is the T4 in this. No top wing. Again, very much a helicopter-inspired cockpit canopy. And reminds me of quite a few expanded universe ships we saw. The other thing is the wings, they're very stiff on mine. Wherever you put them, they're going to stay, but they kind of stop at weird positions. I can push this one almost vertical. This one, well, it kind of stops earlier, but I don't know. It's kind of hard to see. Perception. I do think the starboard one comes down just a bit further, but again, I'm happy enough that they're stiff. I mean, we all like it stiff, so you can position them however. I'm just seeing how even they are. Actually, maybe I lied to you. Maybe it's just perception, because here, when it's on the stand, the gap between the edge of the wing and the table is about the same. I mean, good enough for a cheap little $8-10 toy. Although I don't think that they made many of these. These came out very late in the Titanium series. And you can tell the late ones because they're usually interesting, kind of beta canon or animated, but they also use less metal. I think part of it is just the designs lend themselves more to plastic. Like the wings are plastic, the body's metal, but it is lighter and a little bit small compared to some of the earlier ones. Just how it is. I'm sure they were trying to cut costs by 2008, 2009. That's about the time the series ended. But yeah, it's a neat thing. We do have the door under where the troops would come out. You get very, kind of like someone took a helicopter, but also put some LST from World War II, you know, landing craft features in it. But yeah, I'm actually really happy to get this one. I kind of stumbled into it. There was a point, a year or two back, maybe more than how time goes by quick as you get older, where there are a lot of these on eBay for a really good price, at least compared to what they had been doing. So I snapped up ones that I didn't have in the collection. Now this one here, of course, I'm going to take out the stand again. You saw what a pain it was earlier. Fits the stand well. This is a Hot Wheels. They're the only ones to do the Marauder from, of course, the Bad Batch. So it's actually quite current as we're just into Season 2. It's a good job. I like how the wings don't just fold, but they actually kind of have detents where they lock in. Very well. And this very clearly looks like it's a member of the same family as the Lambda. In fact, going back to the old TIE Fighter video game and X-Wing versus TIE Fighter and all that, doesn't this kind of look like the assault shuttle to you? I think maybe it's the wings that do it for me. Also, the rear turret. The assault shuttle had a rear turret. I mean, looks-wise, it's a little different, but I think when they designed this, they were definitely paying homage to the old LucasArts games. I actually remember those very well because I would design missions for friends. Back then, most mission editors were mostly text-based, or could be anyway, so I like doing that. And being torturous to friends on missions. But yeah, I like that it harkens back. It makes it fit the universe better. And again, it is that step in between the new class, the Omicron here, and the later Lambdas and everything. But I really like it. Unfortunately, because this is so new to the universe, we have very, very little info about it. Aside from, of course, the scenes on board it with the Bad Batch. Moving on to our heavy starfighters. It is really cool they did the Clone Wars Y-wing. This is another one that came out towards the end of the Titanium series. I think they did 2 releases, a standard one and then an Anakin one. I'll be honest with you, I don't remember which one I got. I got whatever I could. I also picked this one up online, and it was a bear to figure out what was the right one because there's so many Y-wings. There's all the Rebel ones. There's the new sequel trilogy ones. So quizzing the sellers to make sure I was ordering the right one. Yeah, when you can't see pictures, it can be a challenge, I'm not going to lie, but it's kind of fun. I actually did it during a snowstorm in a winter, and it came in, and it was correct, and I was happy. You know, the big difference between this and the later Rebel one, the Rebel one has all this kind of angular section removed, pieces missing, the nacelles are less rounded and more chunky, they're also shorter. It only has a crew of 1. This has 2. In universe, they're technically different subvariants anyway, but this was meant to look more modern and sleek and more of a dedicated strike fighter, whereas the Rebels are using theirs as kind of a dogfighter, which explains why only 1 came back from the Death Star. Maybe that's why Vader left the Death Star. He knew what the Y-wing could do. He saw those. He said, oh shit, I'm getting out of here. Man was more clever than you got credit for. Whatever happened to him? But no, I'm really happy that they did this. I don't believe Hot Wheels has ever done the Clone Wars one. It does have little landing gears. Some of these do that come down. Some can be a little loose. This one's pretty tight. Kind of neat. Little toyetic, but that's okay. The canopy's too small to open, and it's really too small to have a moving turret. That's okay. The Rebel ones do have a moving turret, but they're kind of a larger scale. It's mostly metal, but because it's so slim and long, it's just overall smaller than the later Rebel one. The ARC 170. Ever since I heard about this when Revenge of the Sith came out, I was intrigued. It took me years to actually get my hands on an example. And while these are kind of everywhere in the Titanium era, you don't see many in the new Black Series, Titanium, and Hot Wheels era. They've kind of fallen out of favor, and I'm not sure why. This is a good offering from Titanium. It's all metal, at least all 3 wings are. You might expect them to make the upper and lower S-foils or wings plastic, but they didn't. Like a lot of these, though, it has kind of oversized guns, and these are rubber plastic. I'm okay with that. I wish they were a little more into scale, but I'm okay with being rubbery flexy, because otherwise you get stiff and breaky. That's no good, especially with these rear ones. And again, these were intended for children. Don't tell my wife. I still call these models. And it's kind of a smaller scale too because of the larger size. Pretty in keeping with the Y-wing. So it's heavy, it's metal. The only thing is, it doesn't have landing gear. In fact, it doesn't have any action features. And you'd think with the S-foils deployed to attack position, they got the hinge here, they could move, but they don't. I understand why they don't make them move or fold on models where putting a hinge in would look really ugly, but no, not on this one. You really could. And usually they would. We've looked at those shuttles with folding wings and other vessels. I don't know why they didn't. It's kind of strange. And what's even weirder, this is the small scale. You'd think the larger Titanium, they did a one that was like 3 times this size, maybe even 4. It's big. It's about 1/72 scale. How do I know that? Because I actually put Hobby Master pilots in the seats and they fit. So roughly 1/72 scale. It too has fixed wings. Yeah, it comes with opening canopies and seats and everything for the interior, but still fixed S-foils, and I don't know why. one of those mysteries. So that's kind of my only beef with this one. I wish these folded, at least on the larger one, and they don't. The turreted guns don't move in the back, but that's understandable. It'd be nice if they did, but yeah, it's okay. It's a neat design. The nose is a bit odd, but yeah, the connection to Incom and the X-wing is, yeah, we see that. But yeah, it's the heavy craft. I'm not sure how practical armed reconnaissance would be. Almost kind of seems like a wild weasel, long-range striker. Then again, you expect it to carry more torpedoes. Only one launcher with 6 torpedoes. I mean, that's okay, but the Y-wing has 2 with 6 plus bombs. I don't know, seems a little lightly armed, but then again, I guess we could say a lot of this nose is taken up by jammers and electronic warfare. It's cool, it's neat. And that kind of gets us to the stars of the show. The star of any aircraft show, the air superiority, the dogfighters, the ones that get into furballs. So here we have the 3 main fighter interceptors of the clone Navy. Beginning with the Torrent. This was actually by far the hardest one to find. And I did pay a little more for this than I should have, but not crazy. I'm going to be completely honest. It was during 2020 and business was pretty good and we weren't spending much money on anything, even food. So I found one new in the packaging for I think $40, $50, and just went for it. I wanted one new because there's so many moving parts on this. I didn't want one worn out. And I like it. It's a really weird design, but I really needed it for the collection. Mostly I was curious what it looked like. Also, it was the first, and I like chronologies. You might have noticed. In universe, the company that made this would go on, or at least components of them, to make the B-wing. Of course, in the real world, the B-wing was kind of the inspiration for this. But yeah, the kind of overcomplicated but still good design. The wings kind of have detents, not as much as the Hot Wheels, but still good. See, 3 positions for them, and of course this rear one. The only thing is with the stand, you can't fully fold this down, but that's okay. Small price to pay. And no landing gear as such on this. Might have been neat to have them, but then again, it kind of just vertically landed. And yeah, the hinges are a little visible. But again, the design lent itself to having hinges, which is why I just don't understand why the Ark doesn't have one. Little canopy there, little guns. Really like it. It's relatively light because it's so thin, but it's actually a good size model or toy or whatever. You don't see a lot of Torrents. Kind of like with others, I don't think the modern Black Series Titanium or Hot Wheels have ever done these. And unfortunately, these were done like 2008, 2009, again, towards the end of the run. It's funny, in a lot of product lines, the early things end up being the more collectible and hard to find. But it's actually the late titaniums that are more difficult, which in toys is often the case because of limited distribution and production. So I don't mind having paid for it. What's funny is, after I bought it, I saw the prices climbing $50, $60, $80. Happy I bought them. But then again, about 2 years ago, maybe after the COVID stuff kind of died down, a lot of titanium models hit eBay, and the prices dropped again to $40, even $35. I didn't see them go below 30 though, so I didn't feel too ripped off. The next one, the Z-95 Headhunter. I remember my first personal exposure to this was in the Timothy Zahn books. Mara Jade flew one. Also, I think these appeared in, I don't think they were, I can't remember if they were in, no, I don't think they were in X-Wing, sorry. I think I'm mixing up X-Wing versus TIE Fighter. They were definitely in that. I think they first appeared in the TIE Fighter game, which would have been right after Timothy Zahn. Yeah, because X-Wing and TIE Fighter had Thrawn in it. Yes, I'm a nerd, and a nerd with a pretty good memory. Now this one I actually bought used. I didn't do too many used ones, but I couldn't find a new one, at least for money that was crazy, and I found a guy that had like 3 used ships with their stands. Took a gamble on it. It was fine. The only thing I did, I lightly glued the guns on. They're intended to come off, so they don't break. They just come off. But mine were just pegging on a little too light, and I didn't want to lose them. So just a dot of modeling glue. So if they do get hit hard, they'll probably, the glue will break before the gun. Interestingly, unlike the others, they're not rubber. They are actually a hard plastic. The rest of the ship is metal. I believe. Yeah, this does have an opening canopy, but it's very tight. And we do have landing gear. One's a little loose. I noticed the X-wings are loose too, though. This one's tight. This one's a little loose. And we do have the underwing ordnance, which I think is super cool. I always thought this was a neat little craft. And this is how you do fan service right. It makes sense in the universe, so bringing it in for the Clone Wars, yeah, that's fan service done right. It looks like an X-Wing, but not so much so that you're copying it. And it makes sense that there would have been a predecessor to the X-Wing. And a predecessor that served in the Clone Wars. Good size. These aren't super hard to find, but also not super easy. Kind of medium difficulty, which is part of the fun, frankly. And the V-wing, along with the ARC 170, the one I really wanted to get my hands on after Revenge of the Sith. These are produced in quite good numbers. I actually have 2 of them, one in Republic colors and one in Imperial colors. Kind of wish they did the dedicated clone version later on. I think there was a variant of this, much like the Eta-2, that did not have the astromech. I might be misremembering, but I believe the Imperial versions we saw lacked the astromech. If I could do painting, I would actually go in and remove the ball of the droid on my Imperial one and repaint it slate gray, but maybe one day I will. But the Republic one, the original one, would still have him. But the Empire wasn't really big on hyperspace for individual pilots because defections happen that way. Anywho, neat craft. From the front, it's like an odd combination of X-Wing, A-Wing in the middle, and TIE Fighter for the wings and engines in the back because they are twin-ion engines. Kind of reminds me of quote-unquote uglies from some of the expanded universe, There was an ugly that was an X-Wing with a TIE Fighter solar panels instead of wings or S-foils. I forget which book that was in now. But it makes sense for the evolution, especially considering this is supposed to be part of the Delta series, the Blissix. And I know it is Blissix, but I think it's funny. It's Bliss Sex. Yeah. You can't tell me George Lucas didn't do that on purpose, or whoever named him probably wasn't George Lucas. But I bet he signed off on it with a chuckle. Come on, we all know Lucas smokes the reefer. Him and Harrison Ford. Carrie Fisher did the coke. R.I.P. Anyway, neat ship. And since we have a total of 4 folding points, it can be a little fidgety to get them in the right positions. They don't really have detents, and they do kind of overfold, but not too bad. Once you get them fully folded, they've got a little bit of wiggle play, but not too bad. And again, it makes sense in universe for either storage on a ship, landing, or fitting in a hyperdrive ring that you would do that. I think this fits really perfectly. And the fact that it doesn't have a life support system really kind of shows that transition in the TIE Fighter. That's really what we see with the Revenge of the Sith, is a lot of stuff in that slow transition to Imperial architecture and It's neat. It's hard to say. George Lucas had the touch, or at least his team had the touch of making new stuff, but that felt in place in the universe. Like we talked about in the serious part of the video, all these different companies, and you can see kind of a corporate line, a production line, and not just one, but multiples. Something that Star Trek doesn't really do. They kind of have one design, and that's what's carried through over the generations. With Star Wars, you've got Incom and Consular and I was like Kobe. What am I thinking of? Corporal and the Kuat systems. And they each have their own distinct look, but they also fit in the same universe. Very cool. And with that, we'll end with these. I was, of course, being rather tongue-in-cheek about the Jedi, but I do actually find it sincerely funny that they had probably the best fighter interceptor, reconnaissance, starfighter before in the early part of the Clone Wars. I also really legitimately find it weird that George Lucas decided to make them be celibate monks that didn't want attachment. I get the whole over-attachment thing, but man, not letting someone get their rocks off and not express to their loved ones will make anyone go nuts. So maybe the Sith had a point. Hashtag the Sith did nothing wrong. And these were actually pretty challenging for me to buy because people use Jedi Starfighter, Jedi Interceptor interchangeably, and there's so many sub-variants. Again, and when you can see pictures, not a problem. The 7A or just 7, 7B, and then of course the modified, and then of course the Interceptor. And it gets more complicated, but let's start here. Actually, I've got 2 of these. Mostly because the second time I was trying to buy one of the Bs and didn't get one. That's okay. They're neat. I got the first one in a big lot of ships, like 50, and they were all in the package. Kind of neat. This is a nice little model. It's all die cast for the most part, but very thin. It does have a opening canopy, and it does hinge in the front, which is kind of neat to have a moving part on something relatively small like this. No landing gear though, and the screw heads are kind of by necessity pretty dang obvious. But I do like the simple arrow shape of this. It's neat. I have mixed feelings about Attack of the Clones, but I will say that there are parts of it I enjoyed. Yeah, the reason I have 2 of those is I was trying to buy one of these. This one came out pretty late in the run because it was featured in the Clone Wars. And the real world reason we have the 7B was this one was designed for animation. The original one had the astromech on the side, so you couldn't flip the image around. They needed him centerline, so it was could be bisected and they could flip the image around. That's how animation works. And just kind of updated a bit. Yeah, we have that there. The engines hang down more in the bottom. More of a kind of nacelles built in. It is a thicker hull. And I believe the canopy does open on this one too. Finally got one though. There's only a couple of releases of this mold. A lot more of the original. But I like completing the fleet. Really, just as an aside, I picked this one up, the modified one, from that same website that still had new old stock at the old original prices. It's neat. It's got a lot more going on, like a lot of the later ones. It's lighter, less metal, more plastic components. Big guns. It's fine. It's not my favorite, but it's nice to have in the set. I wouldn't go out of my way to pay a whole lot for it, but for the original price, sure, why not? On the other hand, the Eta-2, the original release here from the titanium is nice. It has the folding S-foils, it even has landing gear and an opening canopy, but for whatever reason, it lacks the ion cannon. And what's funny is there's almost a spot for them, a niche. I don't know, found it interesting. I ended up with several of these. I'm not even sure which one I grabbed. It's, I've got Mace Windu's Pimpin' Purple one, Obi's, one of Anakin's. I don't know, I even know if it's the green or the yellow. One I do have that's kind of neat, again I can't see it, but the concept is the Darth Vader one, the silver and black one, that actually came in that big batch I picked up off the guy. It was a good deal, because I was buying in bulk everything he had. He knocked them down like $5 a ship. Some of them were worth about that, others were kind of more collectible. So the Hot Wheels does actually get the cannons right, but it doesn't have any moving parts. And what I wanted to do, I wanted the hyperspace ring version of this. And that turned into about a year-long adventure. For the Delta 7, I kind of got lucky. This also came in, or at least one of these two did, in that big batch. And I thought, how neat. The ring here coming off kind of makes up for this being a somewhat smaller scale than the others. Like I said, I was trying to buy a B, ended up buying a second one of these because they're just all marked as Delta 7, but I'm okay with that. It means I can display one with the ring docked and one with the ring separate. I didn't pay crazy money, so it's fine. The B, they never did a version with a docking ring, I think because it is a larger vessel, or at least, scale, you see here. And also, again, towards the end of the production run. But they definitely did do a ring version for the Eta-2. And I really, really wanted one. And I could not find one. Now, it's not the same ring as this. This won't even fit. No, in universe and in real life, it is a different shape. And it shows. So yeah, when I finally found one, I was very careful, because a lot of them are just marked as like Anakin Starfighter. Only, I think, 3 of the variants out of over a dozen had the ring for this. And it's not just the same ship, but with the ring attached. It's actually a whole new mold. The 2 ring versions, the Delta and the ETA, do seem to be to scale to each other, but smaller than the undocked ships, which makes sense. It's an extra component. And I was very careful and finally did it, and because of that, I probably, if I could see pictures, I'd probably been able to find one a little cheaper because the seller didn't know what they had, but I needed to find a seller that knew what he had, and so I paid for it. I probably paid more for this one than just about any other titanium. I think I paid like $50. So I wasn't sure. But when I got it, I was actually very pleased. Because it's all around better than I expected. Yes, of course, it has the updated hyperspace ring. And it fits very tight. Come on out. There we go. But what really shocks me is how heavy this ring is. This one is very light. Yes, I know that fell over. Oh well. This one's pretty much all plastic polymer, kind of a flexible, so it won't break. Would you quit falling over things? They don't fall over much on like a hard surface, but this is kind of not. Anyway, but this is interesting. The ring is still plastic, although, no, I might have lied to you. I think it's metal. But these engines are definitely metal. This thing is heavy. I mean, this weighs like a Hobby Master ones that are just go like as model. So that was cool, even though I paid for it at least you got a solid filling chunk here. And then I get to the little spacecraft. Again, smaller scale by a good bit. Not half, but maybe 3/2 or 2/3. I'm not sure. Anyway. And I wasn't surprised to learn that the S-foils don't open. It would be very hard to make a reliable hinge. But the canopy does, which kind of surprised me. No landing gear this time. Again, no shocker. But they actually did get the cannon emplacement correct. This one does have the ion cannons and the lasers. So it's kind of funny that the smaller scale one is more accurate than the large one. On the other hand, these came out late in the production. I believe 2008 was the first ring-mounted variant. Oh well. Again, bought during the COVID times. I don't regret it. I'd do it again. It makes me happy. Credit card long since paid off. It's one of the few I just wanted enough that I was willing to pay for. And sometimes that will kind of backfire. Not just with these, but anything. But it worked out. Really like it. And I could probably save a little money if I bought used. But then again, not being able to see photographs, I just normally can't do that. I need to have something in the package. I don't mind if the package is a little ripped, because I don't keep my packaging. These weren't designed for that anyway. The packaging you had to kind of tear apart to get into. But it's just one of those things. Not complaining. Very happy, very fortunate. But it's just one of those factoids of my life. And that's fine. Everyone's got something, right? And I'm no worse off than anyone else. But yeah, I'm very happy with these and kind of having variants. I usually don't get this many, but they're different. Again, and I have a couple of different ones of these in different paint schemes for various reasons. And I've got accidentally 2 of the original Delta 7s. But those all came with the wing, the ring. I don't know why this is so light. This is so much heavier, but I don't know. You can really tell when something's kind of a hobby of someone there that they really want to make right, because then they seem to go above and beyond and do it at this factory. But yeah, a lot of fun. Let me know which version of me you like. Do you like the trying to be serious, comedic at the first? Do you like me just sitting here nerding out at the table? I didn't really intend to be this long, but you know what? Having a good day. Haven't talked Star Wars in a while. Doing laundry, so just kind of waiting on the laundry to go. And again, we've had 7 or 8 hours of serious aircraft videos recently, so let's have a couple of fun times. So if you like this, yeah, let me know, because I could do a Star Trek version or something else, just more in-universe. Anywho, let's wrap this here video up. And with that, I appreciate you indulging me. Let me know what you thought of this, if it was fun. And if you could, please like, share, and subscribe. And hey, if you'd like to pitch a buck or two, then you can go over to the Mishaco Patreon. Why not? But for real, what's kind of your favorite Clone War era ship, fighter, vessel, whatever? This is most all of them. There's a couple that appeared in the films and the Clone War series that we didn't get in some form diecast, but for the most part, we have been lucky enough to get the majority. So anyway, I'm gonna call it a night. Again, appreciate you all. This is Misha. Catch you very soon. Next time. Long live the Empire.